Honourable Members of Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. I'm very happy to be with you here today in Germany, in Berlin, a country and a town that I'm particularly affectionate. Many thanks to the organisers. We had a very good morning of work, and for enabling this conference and this rich and exciting exchange of ideas, which I believe are contributing to the necessary reflection within our national parties and between patriots of all parties in Europe. When we ask the question of direction of the European Union, we must start by following the curve traced by its 70-year-old history. We have just celebrated this event in the European Parliament in Strasbourg last week and try to see where this curve leads us. This curve started 70 years ago, if you believe the official history. It is a little older if we look at the sources that inspired the current construction of Europe. To do this, we need to look at a book written by Coudenhove-Calgary entitled Pan-Europa. The author, who has been somewhat forgotten, although at the time he received the first Prix International de Charlemagne d'Aix-la-Chapelle, the Internationale Karlspreis zu Aachen. This is the oldest and most famous award for commitment to European unification. We are in 1923, and he outlines the prospective considerations for Europe. The author is remarkable for the freshness of his thinking, since his book, written after the Great War, outlines a surprising contemporary vision of the European Union. When you read it, you sometimes forget that it was written a century ago. So familiar are the ideas it sets out to us Europeans living in the 21st century. He speaks of a future European entity that would have broken down its national internal borders. An entity without precise geographical limits, an area of customs union, note the modernity of the terms, of nation states that would be merged by the virtue of a process of integration, particularly economic integration. An entity built on the model of the Pan-Americanism, which was a union including the South American states and the United States, and a vast program of student exchanges. This reminds us of our contemporary Erasmus, a process that begins with an agreement on coal and steel. He envisages the reunion of the world in a large regional entities in order to finally move, and he barely conceals this, towards a government of the world. He says, it is Europe that we must unite first, and then humanity, a treaty of applied globalism. So what is the situation today? If we look at the history of humanity, an age-old struggle between peoples and nations and empires jumps to the eye. The empire of Alexander, the Roman Empire that conquered us, the Gauls, the Napoleon Empire that turned Europe upside down, the French colonial empire, the USSR, etc. All these empires possessed the necessary resources to survive. But all these empires also had same characteristics that made the same promises and, above all, had the same defects. First of all, they had a centralized and superior authority, a superstructure that dictates the law. Secondly, it was an administration not of individuals, but of populations. Thirdly, they had a firm belief in their superior values. Fourthly, they proclaimed a unifying ideology. Fifthly, the physical and moral capacity to normalize recalcitrant peoples or minds. 6, the idea and concept of creating a new man. And 7, the desire or even the obligation to expand permanently. The Roman Empire never stopped growing, and when it did, the peoples of the empire softened, and the Gauls, who had been warriors, became Gallo-Romans, weakened by the Pax Romana in a territory too vast to defend or be loved. When the Germanic invasions came, these people, devoid of affectio imperialis, were psychologically incapable of defending themselves. And the Western Roman Empire sank. As soon as the empire had no more conquests, no more dreams of expansions to share, it was doomed. At last, of course, empires have a promise of eternity. And so what, will you say to me now that I've put these historical political arguments to you today? Why am I adding these to the debate? Well, we need to realize that the European Union ticks all the boxes that are characteristic of an empire. Let's go over the characteristics of the European Union one by one. Superior authority, well, in the EU, that's called the Commission. It's certainly not a European emperor until they elect a European president, but it is definitely a technocratic nebula. The administration of populations. In the European, we do not speak of citizens of this or of that country, but we speak of citizens of the Union, although there is no such thing as a European people. And above all, we speak of consumers. The EU's firm belief of bearing superior values. Well, union values are constantly invoked, and these soft law values are applied on all occasions and considered superior, even superior to the will of the people, as some referendums have shown, right? These values are then the pretext for universal moral lessons and for obligations imposed on member states. They are used as threats, as reasons for sanctions, or even by the European courts. The EU has a federating ideology. It is a merchant empire with merchant and mercantile values, an ultra-liberal ideology which centers all human activity around trade. For the EU, man is no longer a person rooted in his family, his region, his country, his culture, but an economic agent, a consumer, a producer. The capacity of normalization. Although Mrs. von der Leyen does not send tanks as during the days of the Warsaw Pact, and I did think about my words, she does use a very powerful budgetary weapon. Remember that before the Italian elections, she proclaimed, for example, that she would sanction Italy financially if it voted badly. The emergence of a new man. Well, this new man for the EU is a nomadic man freed from his ties, affections, natural attachments, and cultural references. The desire for permanent expansion. Well, it is a combination of territorial conquest. We see that membership of new membership states is bought in exchange for subsidies, but it is also the expansion of free trade agreements and treaties that allow countries on the other side of the globe to enter this merchant empire without any geographical constraints. The promise of eternity? Well, the idea that the European Union is the ultimate outcome of European history and the perfect institutional order. Europhiles consider this concept unquestionable and even immoral to reconsider. There is no alternative to us, they say. This is the Tina principle, right? There is no alternative. Well, let me tell you, we are Tina. Today, the EU, which is in crisis, has embarked on a fast and furious flight into the future by planning the accession of Kosovo, Croatia, or Ukraine, all countries that are economically and institutionally incompatible with our countries. So why is it so important to analyze the nature of the European Union? Well, because it tells us who we are dealing with. The empire's nation reading grid allows us to understand the developments that await us. Empire means imperialism, that is to say, the subjugation of people, the destruction of identities, and the increasingly oppressive affirmation of an oligarchic power that is far removed from citizens and in the end causes war and general chaos. But it also means, and this will be my conclusion, a programmed end of the European Union as we know it today. Indeed, there is no such thing as an internal empire. By nature, empires are artificial constructions, human constructions built initially maybe through common effort, but ultimately maintained by violence, coercions, threats, and pressure. Empires have always been parentheses in the history of peoples and men. No empire state lasts and none resists the only human reality that is worthwhile, the peoples and their institutionalized form, the nation state. The USSR lasted about 70 years. The European Union has just celebrated its 70 years. I want to see a favorable omen. Tomorrow's Europe will once again be the Europe of peoples and free nations. Thank you.